You know, after 40 years on the bench here at Providence Municipal Court, you develop a certain sense, call it intuition, call it experience, call it whatever you want. But when that courtroom door opened that Tuesday morning and I looked up from my case file, something in my chest told me this wasn't going to be an ordinary day. The woman who walked in was dressed impeccably, and I mean impeccably. We're talking designer everything, the kind of handbag that costs more than most people's cars. Diamond earrings that caught the fluorescent lights of my courtroom and threw little rainbows across the walls. Her heels clicked against the floor with a rhythm that seemed to announce, I don't belong here, and I know it. Now, I've seen wealthy people in my courtroom before. Providence has its share of successful folks, and traffic tickets don't discriminate based on bank accounts. But there was something different about this woman. It wasn't just the clothes or the jewelry, it was the way she carried herself. Chin tilted slightly upward, a half smile playing on her lips that seemed to say this whole proceeding was beneath her, an inconvenience, a joke. I glanced down at the file in front of me. Victoria Ashworth Pemberton. The name alone told a story, multiple parking violations, failure to pay fines, and now she was here because the accumulated penalties had reached a point where a court appearance was mandatory. The total owed was substantial, but for someone of her means, it was pocket change, literally pocket change. But here's the thing that caught my attention, and I want you to understand this because it's important. Standing behind her, slightly to the left, was a young man, mid-20s maybe. He wore a suit that was clean, but clearly not expensive, the kind you buy when you need to look professional but can't afford to spend much. His shoes were polished but worn at the heels, and his eyes were fixed on the floor with a weight that I recognized immediately. That's the look of someone carrying shame that isn't even theirs to carry. I've seen that look on the faces of children whose parents are in trouble, on spouses who stand by silently while their partners face consequences, on employees who have to witness their employer's worst moments. And I knew right then that whatever was about to unfold in my courtroom was going to involve both of these people in ways that wouldn't be immediately obvious. Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton approached the bench, and I noticed her driver, because that's what I assumed the young man was, hesitate near the gallery. She didn't look back at him, didn't acknowledge him at all. He was invisible to her, a piece of furniture that happened to have followed her into the building. Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton, I said, keeping my voice neutral, professional. Good morning. Do you understand why you're here today? She actually laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable chuckle, a genuine, amused laugh, as if I had told her a mildly entertaining joke at a cocktail party. Oh, Judge, she said, and the way she said judge made it sound almost like a term of endearment one might use for a child playing dress-up. I'm here because your little system couldn't figure out how to process a simple payment. My accountant handles these things, and apparently there was some mix-up. I'm sure we can sort this out quickly. I have a luncheon at noon. I set my pen down slowly. In my experience, the way someone responds to that first question tells you almost everything you need to know about how the rest of the proceeding will go. Some people are terrified, some are apologetic, some are confused, but dismissive amusement, that's something else entirely. That's someone who has gone through life believing that rules are suggestions meant for other people. But I didn't react. I've learned not to react. Instead, I looked past her, just for a moment, at the young man in the gallery. He had lifted his eyes now, and they met mine briefly. In that fraction of a second, I saw something that made my heart shift in my chest. I saw desperation. I saw a silent plea. And I saw fear, not for himself, but for something else, something I didn't yet understand. Well, I said, returning my attention to the woman before me, let's take our time and make sure we understand everything correctly. Talk to me. Help me understand your situation. She sighed as if I was being deliberately difficult. And that's when I knew this case was going to require patience. It was going to require me to dig deeper than the surface, to look past the diamonds and the designer labels, and to find the human story buried underneath all that privilege. Because there's always a story, always. And my job, my real job, isn't just to pass judgment. It's to understand. Now, let me tell you something about questioning. In all my years, I've learned that the direct approach doesn't always reveal the truth. Sometimes you have to come at things sideways. You have to ask the questions that seem irrelevant until suddenly they're the only questions that matter. Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton, I began, leaning back in my chair slightly, adopting the posture of someone who has all the time in the world. I see here that these parking violations occurred over a period of several months, different locations around Providence. Can you tell me about that? She waved her hand dismissively, her diamond bracelet catching the light. Shopping, charity events, the usual. I can't be expected to circle blocks looking for meters, Judge. That's what the fines are for, aren't they? A convenience fee, really. I'd happily pay triple if it meant I didn't have to waste time with parking. I see. I made a note, though what I was really doing was buying time, observing. And the failure to pay the accumulated fines, that was an oversight by your accountant, you said. Exactly. She smiled, clearly pleased that I was catching on. Richard, my husband, Richard Pemberton, you may have heard of him, Pemberton Holdings. Richard handles all the finances through our family office. These small matters just slipped through the cracks. It happens when you're managing significant assets. I nodded slowly. Pemberton Holdings, yes, I'm familiar with the name. How could I not be? They owned half the commercial real estate in Rhode Island. And Richard, your husband, he's aware you're here today? Something flickered across her face, just for a moment. A micro-expression that most people would miss, but I've been reading faces for 4 decades. It was fear, real fear. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that polished smile. Richard is traveling on business. Singapore, I believe. Or was it Hong Kong? He's always somewhere. She laughed again, but this time it sounded different. Hollow. He doesn't concern himself with these little matters. I understand. I paused, then gestured toward the gallery. And the young man who came in with you, is he here in some official capacity? For the first time, Victoria Ashworth Pemberton looked uncomfortable. She glanced back at the young man, and I saw something pass between them. A warning in her eyes, a deeper fear in his. That's Marcus. He works for the family. He drove me here today. Marcus. I said the name thoughtfully, then addressed the young man directly. Marcus, would you mind approaching the bench for a moment? You should have seen the look on her face. It was as if I had suggested something scandalous, something that violated the natural order of things. Servants don't speak in courtrooms. They drive, they wait, they remain invisible. But this is my courtroom, and in my courtroom everyone has a voice. Marcus walked forward slowly, his movements careful, measured. As he got closer, I could see the details I'd missed from a distance. His hands were calloused, not the hands of someone who only drives cars. His face was young but tired, with lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. And on his left hand, I noticed something interesting, a simple gold wedding band. Marcus, I said gently, how long have you worked for the Pemberton family? He cleared his throat. 3 years, Your Honor. And what exactly do you do for them? He hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton. I saw her give an almost imperceptible shake of her head, but I also saw something else in Marcus's eyes, a dam about to break, pressure that had been building for too long. I'm the family's personal assistant, Your Honor. I drive, I run errands, I handle things. Handle things. I repeated the phrase, letting it sit in the air. What kinds of things? Judge Caprio, Victoria interrupted, her voice sharp now, the pretense of amusement completely gone. I don't see what my employee's job description has to do with parking tickets. This is highly irregular. I held up my hand calmly. Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton, I appreciate your concern, but I'm trying to understand the full picture here. Bear with me. I turned back to Marcus. You said you handle things. I'm curious. These parking tickets, the ones we're discussing today. Were you driving the vehicle when any of these violations occurred? The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus's face went pale. Victoria's went red. And I knew that I had stumbled onto something significant. Your Honor, Victoria said quickly, whatever he says, I want it on record that I am fully responsible for Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton. My voice was firm but not unkind. Please, let the young man answer. Marcus looked at her, then at me, then at the floor. His hands were trembling slightly. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, Your Honor, I was driving. All of those times, I was driving. Now we were getting somewhere. Now the pieces were starting to come together, but I could sense there was more, much more beneath the surface, and I was determined to find it. Talk to me, Marcus, I said softly, leaning forward. Help me understand what's really going on here. He took a deep breath, and I could see him wrestling with something internal, loyalty versus truth, fear versus relief, silence versus the overwhelming need to finally be heard. It's complicated, Your Honor. I have time, I said. We all have time. This is Providence Municipal Court, not a drive-through window. Tell me your story. What happened next is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my days on this bench. You see, in this job, you think you've seen everything. You think you've heard every story, witnessed every kind of human struggle. But then a moment comes along that reminds you, humbles you really, that you haven't seen anything yet. Marcus stood there, his whole body tense, and I watched as something inside him simply broke. Not in a dramatic way, not with shouting or crying, but with a quiet surrender. His shoulders dropped, his eyes lifted to meet mine, and he began to speak. Your Honor, my wife is sick. Cancer, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Even the usual background noise, the shuffling of papers, the quiet coughs, everything stopped. I felt my own heart constrict in my chest. I'm so sorry, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. Please continue. We don't have insurance, not real insurance. The Pembertons, they pay me cash, under the table mostly. It's more money than I could make anywhere else with just a high school diploma, so I took the job. But it means no benefits, no health coverage, nothing. He paused, steadying himself. Victoria Ashworth Pemberton had gone very still beside him, her face unreadable. When Sophie, that's my wife, when Sophie got diagnosed, we didn't know what to do. The treatment costs, Your Honor, you can't imagine. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. We sold everything. Our car, our furniture, my grandmother's ring that had been in the family for generations. Everything. And it still wasn't enough. And the Pembertons, I asked quietly. Did you ask them for help? Marcus let out a sound that was almost a laugh but held no humor. I asked Mr. Pemberton once, just once. He told me that personal matters were personal matters and business was business. He said if I needed time off to handle things, he'd have to find a replacement. So I didn't ask again. I glanced at Victoria. Her expression had changed. She was looking at Marcus now, really looking at him, as if seeing him for the first time. But then, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger, Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton came to me about 3 months ago. She said she'd heard about Sophie. She said she wanted to help, but it had to be quiet. Mr. Pemberton couldn't know. Now I was truly intrigued. Help how? She's been paying for Sophie's treatment, all of it, out of her own accounts, the ones Mr. Pemberton doesn't monitor. She set up everything, the hospital, the specialists, the experimental drugs that aren't covered by any insurance. She saved my wife's life, Your Honor. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. I looked at Victoria Ashworth Pemberton with new eyes. The designer clothes, the diamonds, the affected attitude. Suddenly, it all looked different, like armor, like a costume she wore to survive in a world that demanded she be something she wasn't. Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton, I said slowly, is this true? For a long moment she didn't answer. Then finally she spoke, and her voice was completely different now. Smaller, more human, stripped of all pretense. Richard controls everything, Judge Caprio. Every dollar, every decision, every moment of my life. I married into a prison made of gold, and most days I can barely breathe. But I have a small trust from my grandmother, funds that are technically mine. And when I learned about Sophie, I had to do something. I had to prove to myself that I was still capable of being a decent human being. She paused, and I saw tears forming in her eyes, the first genuine emotion I'd witnessed from her all morning. The parking tickets, the fines. Marcus wasn't parking illegally because he was careless. He was rushing. Every time he was rushing to pick up Sophie's medications, to get her to appointments, to handle emergencies. And I told him not to worry about tickets, that I would handle everything. But Richard froze my accounts last month as punishment for, well, it doesn't matter what for. The point is, I couldn't pay the fines. I couldn't pay anything. And now we're here. I sat back in my chair, absorbing everything I had just heard. In my 40 years, I thought I had seen every configuration of human circumstance. But here was something new. A billionaire's wife, who was herself a kind of prisoner, secretly using her limited resources to save the life of her employee's wife, while her husband remained oblivious, traveling the world and controlling every aspect of her existence. Marcus, I said, how is Sophie doing now? For the first time, Marcus smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. The treatment is working, Your Honor. The doctors say she might be in remission. She might actually beat this thing. Because of Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton. Because she cared when she didn't have to. I felt my own eyes growing moist. This job, this beautiful, heartbreaking job of mine, it never stops teaching me about the complexity of human beings, about how people can surprise you, about how kindness can exist in the most unexpected places, often hidden, often unrecognized, but present nonetheless. Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton, I said, I owe you an apology. When you walked in here today, I made assumptions. I looked at the surface and thought I knew what I was seeing. I was wrong. She shook her head, wiping her eyes carefully. You weren't wrong, Judge. I am who I appeared to be most of the time. I've become that person, but sometimes you get a chance to remember who you used to be, who you could still be if circumstances were different. I want you to understand something about courtrooms. People think they're cold places, all rules and procedures and formal language, but that's not true. A courtroom is one of the most human spaces you can find. It's where people come when everything else has failed. It's where truth and consequence meet. And on this particular morning, my courtroom had become something even more. It had become a confessional, a place of unexpected revelations. I looked around the room. Inspector Quinn, who had been standing by the door, had his arms folded across his chest, but his expression had softened. My bailiff, Tommy, who's been with me for 15 years and thinks he's seen it all, was staring at the ground, clearly moved. In the gallery, a woman I didn't recognize, probably waiting for her own case to be called, was openly crying, tissues pressed to her face. And then there was my son, David, who helps me in court and who knows me better than almost anyone. He caught my eye from across the room, and I saw him give a small nod. He knew what I was thinking. He knew what I was going to do. And Marcus, I continued, you've been carrying a weight that no one should have to carry alone. But you found an angel in the last place you expected. Isn't that something? Isn't that the most human thing in the world? Marcus was crying too now, silently, his jaw tight. Yes, Your Honor, he managed. I took a deep breath. It was time. In the matter of the City of Providence versus Victoria Ashworth Pemberton, I began, my voice steady, regarding the accumulated parking violations and unpaid fines totaling $4,700, I have reached a decision. The courtroom held its breath. You could have heard a pin drop on that wooden floor. First, let me address the facts as I now understand them. These violations occurred while Marcus, an employee of the Ashworth Pemberton household, was operating a vehicle registered to the defendant. The violations occurred in the course of Marcus performing duties related to the medical emergency of his wife, Sophie. Furthermore, I have learned that the defendant, Victoria Ashworth Pemberton, has been secretly funding Sophie's cancer treatment, an act of extraordinary generosity that has likely saved a young woman's life. I let that sink in for a moment before continuing. Now, let's talk about what justice means in a case like this. The law is clear. The registered owner of a vehicle is responsible for violations incurred by that vehicle. Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton is technically liable for these fines, but the law also grants me discretion, the ability to weigh circumstances, to consider context, to remember that the purpose of justice is not simply to punish, but to serve the greater good. I looked directly at Victoria. Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton, you came into this courtroom wearing a mask. We all wear masks sometimes, but what I've learned today is that beneath your mask is a woman who saw someone suffering and chose to help, who risked her own security, her husband's disapproval, his control over her life, to do the right thing. That is not nothing. That is everything. I shifted my gaze to Marcus. And Marcus, you've shown me something too. You've shown me loyalty, dignity, and grace under pressure. You've shown me a man who works hard, who loves his wife, who carries himself with integrity, even when life hands him more than anyone should have to bear. I leaned forward, folding my hands on the bench in front of me. Here is my ruling. The fines totaling $4,700 are hereby reduced to $100, a nominal amount to satisfy the requirements of the court. However, this $100 will not be paid by Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton. I reached into my own pocket, pulled out my wallet, and removed two $50 bills. The courtroom gasped audibly. I will pay this fine myself, I said, placing the bills on my bench, because today I witnessed something that renewed my faith in humanity. I witnessed a wealthy woman who used her privilege not for herself, but for someone else. I witnessed an employee who treated his employer with loyalty and respect even when he had every reason to feel bitter. And I witnessed two people from completely different worlds finding common ground in the most fundamental human experience, caring for someone who is sick, hoping for a miracle, and doing whatever it takes to make that miracle happen. Victoria was sobbing now, her carefully maintained composure completely gone. Marcus had his arm around her, steadying her, and in that moment the barriers between them, employer and employee, billionaire's wife and working-class driver, simply didn't exist. Now let me say something to everyone in this courtroom today, and to anyone who may be watching or listening later. I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as I could. We live in a world that loves to divide us, rich and poor, powerful and powerless, us and them. But those divisions are lies. They're stories we tell ourselves to avoid the more difficult truth that we are all connected, all vulnerable, all in need of each other. Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton could have ignored Marcus's situation. It would have been easy. She could have stayed in her bubble of privilege and comfort, and no one would have judged her for it, because that's what we expect from people with money. But she didn't. She reached across the divide. She remembered that her humanity was more important than her status. And Marcus could have been angry. He could have resented the wealth that surrounded him every day, while his wife was dying and he couldn't afford treatment. But instead, when help was offered, he accepted it with gratitude and dignity. He didn't let bitterness poison his heart. That, my friends, is the lesson. That is what I want you to take from this courtroom today. We don't get to choose our circumstances. We don't get to choose whether we're born rich or poor, healthy or sick, lucky or unlucky. But we do get to choose how we treat each other. We get to choose compassion over indifference, connection over isolation, love over fear. I stood up slowly, something I don't usually do during a ruling, but this moment called for it. Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton, you are free to go with the court's gratitude and blessing. Marcus, please give Sophie my best wishes for her continued recovery. Tell her that she is in the prayers of the Providence Municipal Court. I smiled at them both. And tell her that sometimes angels come in the most unexpected packages. Victoria stepped forward, still crying. Judge Caprio, she said, her voice breaking, thank you, not for dismissing the fines. Thank you for seeing me, for really seeing me. I can't remember the last time anyone did that. I nodded, feeling my own emotions threatening to overwhelm me. That's what we're here for, Mrs. Ashworth Pemberton. That's what we're all here for, to see each other, to recognize the humanity in every face, no matter how much wealth or poverty, power or powerlessness is wrapped around it. As they left my courtroom, walking side by side like equals, which they were, which they had always been, I sat back down and took a moment to collect myself. My bailiff Tommy handed me a glass of water, and I could see that his eyes were red. That was something else, Judge, he said quietly. That's the job, Tommy, I replied. That's always been the job, finding the humanity, honoring the struggle, and believing, always believing, that mercy is stronger than judgment. I looked at my calendar. The next case was waiting, another person, with another story, another struggle, another chance for grace. And I was ready. Because that's what we do here at Providence Municipal Court. That's what we've always done. And that's what we'll keep doing, one case at a time, one person at a time, for as long as I'm blessed to sit on this bench. Thank you for letting me share this story with you. Remember, be kind to each other. You never know what someone is carrying.